Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Anarata Bashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you're joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post questions for our guests. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you. Today's guest will be introduced by Professor Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anna. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Vitaly Chernetsky, who is a very prominent name in Ukrainian cultural studies and beyond. Professor Chernetsky is joining us now from Basel, Switzerland, where he is a fellow, and he is also for more than 10 years professor on faculty in University of Kansas at Lawrence. Vitaly Chernetsky is native of Odesa, Ukraine. He studied at Duke. He received his PhD from University of Pennsylvania. He is current president of the Association of Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, and much, much more. He is known as a translator of Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism, Ukraine Book of the Year Award, and translations into English of one of the Ukraine's leading contemporary authors, Yuri Andrukhovich. Dr. Chernetsky, welcome to our 127th weekly meeting of M-Ukraine Discussion Group at Marshall University, West Virginia. The talk is titled A Farewell to Empire Revisited, Ukraine's Cultural Decolonization in Regional Contexts. Please, Dr. Chernetsky.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fett. Thank you so much, dear colleagues, for this opportunity and for everyone watching and listening to this lecture. I will now share a screen for my PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully the technology gods will be with us. So, in my lecture today, I hope to talk about, actually, let's go back to the start slide because I wanted to explain the picture here, how Ukraine's processes of decolonization went and how they have been developing, and put it not just as an internal view within Ukraine, but to more broadly contextualize it within East European contexts. And of course, we need to talk about many different contexts. Some other contexts would be to put Ukraine in decolonial context associated comparatively or contrastively with countries of the global South, or for instance, with Ireland within Europe. But today I will talk more about the context within the more immediate region. The image you see on the right is a statue in Western Ukraine, which was one of the Soviet-era monuments that was, in fact, quite aesthetically interesting and daring. It used to stand near the Olesko Castle in the Lviv Oblast, but it started disintegrating, and this disintegration of Sovietness, I think, is an apt metaphor for what has been happening there. So in 1890-91, as we know, a wave of change swept across Central and Eastern Europe, and Indiana University's Professor Patrick Kenny actually described it as a carnival of revolution. In that book, he talked about some countries within the then Soviet bloc as places where this was an exuberant and mostly peaceful change. And his primary focus was on Poland, Czechoslovakia, the GDR, Hungary, and within Yugoslavia, Slovenia, and within the then Soviet Union, Ukraine. Baltic states could also be put in this context, but they were not part of his books. He also very much differentiated this from what happened in other parts of the region, Romania, for example, where the process of change and the feelings that generated were far less carnivalesque, let alone the wars, horrible, bloody wars that were accompanying the disintegration of Yugoslavia. At the time, as we remember, a lot of intellectuals talked about the end of history, that history as we know it was over, and we are now supposedly living in post-historical times. Of course, very soon they were proven wrong, so it was not an end of history, but it was definitely an end of a paradigm. And we then saw a tentative emergence into a known and exciting future. And just as in the years of de-Stalinization in the second half of the 1950s, many of the creative figures focused on rejecting the old system's lies and deception. A twist was that this was also the time of a peak of interest in and the practice of a different strategy of artistic subversion, which is associated with postmodernism, a playful exploration and deconstruction of the dominant culture. Here is an example that comes from Czech literature, and this is Joachim Topol, who is the leading Czech prose writer of the generation around the collapse of communist rule. And this is from his short story, A Trip to the Train Station, which became very much one of the iconic texts associated with the change that accompanied the collapse of communist rule. And it is the story that is almost feels like a prose poem with a refrain of "Město se měnilo," the city was changing. So indulge me with a quote. The city peeled off its stern and gloomy face of the past, the mask of rotting Bolshevism, and replaced it with 1,000 others. Some wear the smiley makeup faces of clowns, and who'd give a damn if those wacky old circus ring alcoholics smelling of sawdust and animal dung cover up a few little pockmarks here and there, or a two-bit scar from a two-bit stab wound. Brightly colored buffoon kissers painted on for rowdy youngsters, for female sightseers from around the globe, for the first shy kisses and fleeting touches, for the first marijuana cigarette in the mysterious twilight of foreign lands wrapped in a web of legends, for wannabe artists in a haze of romance, rust under their nails from the Iron Curtain, behind which, at long last, no more tank parades, just Punch and Judy for sons and daughters from well-to-do families with fabulous passports who came to Eastern Europe to go wild, expecting a menagerie and they found a jungle, expecting a jungle and they found a warehouse of scrapped stage scenery, searching for the spirit, and the mirror-faced boogeyman got them. So as you already see from this quote, there is a lot of disconcerting and subverting things there. And then, of course, Romania, as an example of a very, very violent and very bloody events of a collapse of communism. And for those who want to delve deeper in it, I recommend a wonderful film from 1992, so made very soon after the collapse of communist rule in Ukraine, in Romania, The Oak, or in the original Romanian Balance, by Lucian Pintilia, where it's a brutal, brutal film with physical violence, sexual violence, a lot of death of innocents, but it's a film that gives us a strong and authentic view of the traumatic change and paradoxical hope in the context of all of this trauma, something that for us in Ukraine and Ukrainians and sympathizers of Ukraine around the world, we recognize, given the context of traumas accompanying Russia's aggression against Ukraine. If we look to other places, an interesting example comes from the Kazakh filmmaker Rashid Nugmanov, his film The Wild East, which was filmed on the shore of Lake Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan, is a post-apocalyptic riff imagining an alternative to the Seventh Samurai of Akira Kurosawa and their remake by, in the Hollywood, The Magnificent Seven, which was then released in the Soviet Union, and it was a widely known and popular sort of cult film for many decades. This is a, he both literalizes and subverts the premise of Seven Samurai, but also the utopian aspirations of Soviet revolutionary projects, of the old Russian imperial intelligentsia, and also, of course, gives it a early post-colonial twist. This is a film that at the time generated a lot of discussion, but is not as well known now, and I think it really deserves to be more widely known and appreciated. In Russia, and sorry for bringing this up, but this is a good example of something that was hopeful but then went horribly wrong. Viktor Pelevin is a writer who both illustrates the hopes associated around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and later development, the very dark development that was associated with the more sort of cynical post-ideological neo-authoritarian developments in Russia starting in the 21st century. But if we look at his works from the early 1990s, his playful subversion of Soviet imperial legacies and his short stories and the two short novels, Amon Ra and The Yellow Arrow, they actually were brilliant deconstructions, I think, of the empire that was also an empire of signs in Roland Barthes' sense, sort of a semiotic construct that was trying to dominate everything, and in actually where fakery, pretension, sort of Potemkin villages, gone hyper in the context of contemporary computer-based civilization was seen as something that was explaining the essence of that empire. So I just gave a little bit of that introductory context, but what I wanted to say is that Ukraine represents a particularly rich site of documentation and reflection of those changes and of decolonizing processes within that reflection. So documentation, reflection, and action actually should be. And of course, it has, and this lecture series is an example of telling us about it. It gave us newfound global attention for all of us, the global Ukrainian community and sympathizers of Ukraine, and people, of course, in Ukraine in the context of the war. We see a broad reassessment of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, of the post-Soviet Russian Federation as a colonial empire with multiple enduring challenges. And Ukraine's status as a victim of aggression has led to the efforts to gain greater knowledge and understanding of its cultural history and to try belatedly to hear the messages that Ukraine has been sending for years, indeed for centuries. And there has been primarily attention to contemporary voices, but I think we would agree that there is a need to dig deeper into the past. I will stay with the post-independence period, but will contextualize a little bit in what is happening before shortly the collapse of the Soviet Union and the restoration of independence. And the title of today's talk I actually took from a wonderful book from the scholar Oleg Gnatyuk, who is a member of the Ukrainian minority in Poland, and professor emerita at the University of Warsaw. This is her book, A Farewell to Empire, Ukrainian Debates on Identity. You see the cover of the original Polish edition on the left. Ukrainian language edition was published 2 years later. On the right is the photo of Professor Gnatyuk. And that was, I think, a most important book early on that tried to capture the struggle that we had in the context of Ukrainian culture and the society as it was processing the collapse of the empire and looking trying to answer the identity questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And if we look at the historical context at the time of the restoration of independence, the most immediate one was the trauma of the Chernobyl accident. That's why one of the best books on Ukraine's 1990s, Tamara Hundarova's The Post-Chernobyl Library, Після Чорнобильська бібліотека, which now is also available in English translation, published in 2019, talks about that trauma as something that weighed very much on Ukrainian restoration of independence. As Yuri Andrukhovich said in one of his essays, our independence arrived with the bitter aftertaste of the apocalyptic, given the context of the nuclear accident. Stagnation era repression was especially harsh in Ukraine, much harsher than in many other parts of the Soviet Union. It endured later into the 1980s. And in addition to the carnivalesque revolutions that we can talk about, Ukraine also had a very serious attempts of the human rights work that were legacies of the work of the 1960s. This is the generation. And here I'm speaking of the so-called revolution on the granite, the students protesting and the hunger strike in the 1990, 1991, which started the changes in Ukraine in a very meaningful way, and which remained underappreciated culturally and historically until more recently. We have a wonderful novel by the Ukrainian writer Oksana Ulsyshina, who is now based in Austin, Texas. She teaches at the University of Texas. And this is her novel Ivan y Feba, which is also now available in English translation, Ivan and Phoebe. I strongly recommend it if you want to find out more about the revolution on the granite and Ukraine's revolutionary events of 1990-1991. This is the best literary work about it. One of the other important aspects is the legacies of Soviet-era school curriculum and its reductive messages. One of the colleagues just posted on Facebook, he found one of the secondary school textbooks for Ukrainian literature that he used and that I remember using well over 40 years ago. And it was dreadful. It was horrible. It included some nice, talented, wonderful works of literature, but they made maybe about a quarter to a third of the curriculum. The rest was unreadable. It was Soviet socialist realist dreck, and the context in which it was presented made even the wonderful works of literature less conducive to appreciation. And legacies of Russian and Soviet imperial stereotyping that weighed very, very hard on Ukraine. We can classically say that, a lot, the standard sort of line from many Russian visitors or Russian commentators on Ukraine saying how they love Ukraine and they love Ukrainian food and they love Ukrainian folk singing and folk dancing. But Ukrainian culture is much more than food, folk singing, and folk dancing. And in fact, this is a very reductive colonial stereotype that deprives a nation of its idea of modern, diverse culture and reduces it to ritualized stereotypes associated with folklore. And so in the early 1990s, we had the simultaneous arrival of two major discourses that started transforming the understanding and appreciation of what culture is doing and where it is developing. And on the Russian side of things, it started with the publication of Mikhail Epstein's essay, After the Future, which was published in the January 91 issue of Znamya, one of the leading then Russian literary journals. And postmodernism with it arrives as the it term, so to speak, in the Russophone cultural space, not only in Russia, but much more broadly. So still, this is the final year of Soviet Union's existence. So the colonial imperial channels of dissemination still apply. But very soon, it was in fact written in 91, just published in 92, Australian Slavist, Australian of Ukrainian background, Professor Marko Pavlishin, launched a critical discourse on postmodernism and post-colonialism in Ukrainian context with his article Cossacks in Jamaica, and it's an allusion to a poem Kozak Jamaica by Yuri Andruchovich, a writer whom Victor has already mentioned in his introduction. So in Ukraine, we see simultaneously both the discourse on postmodernism and the discourse on post-colonialism starting to develop. And in Russia, discourse on colonialism and post-colonialism and decolonization is absolutely rejected in the 1990s, and it is discovered only about a decade later. And then, of course, as often happens, a lot of the intellectuals who try to introduce it in the Russian context say that they claim they're first. They're absolutely ignorant of Ukrainian context and the history of Ukrainian discourse on post-colonialism as it was developing in the 1990s, but that's a familiar, if separate, story. So if we look at the examples of that saying farewell to empire and participating in carnivalesque revolutions, at the center of this would be, among others, this trio of poets who later expanded to other genres, prose and drama in some cases, who started as sort of a neo-avant-garde, a post-avant-garde literary group with onomatopoeic name Bubabu. It was formed in 1988. At the center is Yuri Andruchovich. On the left is Viktor Nebrak. On the right is Alexander Irvanets. So three poets, all at the time in their late 20s, who tried to make Ukrainian culture seem fun, seem playful, seem irreverent and subversive, and not only seem, but actually be that, do those gestures of subversion and liberate a new quality that this Soviet repression was preventing it from achieving. And the places, probably the most symbolic, the most famous place where this was happening was a festival in Lviv, which was called Vivek. And Vivek means a dislocation of a joint, but this is like a sort of deliberate subversive name. And the festival took place twice, first in 1990 and then in 1992. And you see a photo from the 92 festival. And at the center of the 92 festival, there was an event that they called Poezo Opera, so a poetry opera, Chrysler Imperial, so Chrysler Imperial. And there was an actual 1930s American Chrysler that appeared on stage at some point. But more importantly, this was an event that was a subversive, playful, explosive deconstruction of both official Soviet culture and the traditional reductive version of what a Ukrainian national culture is, dominated by colonial stereotypes. It is trying to open up Ukrainian culture to new post-imperial, post-colonial future, and do that in a subversive, playful, carnivalizing way. Yuri Andruchovich also engaged with this in his first novel, titled Recreations in English, translated by Marko Pavlishin, whom I mentioned earlier. This is a novel that is based on it combines real and fictional events, or rather it's a fictionalized version of a Ukrainian literary festival, cultural festival, but it is not in a real town, it's an invented town. And we follow perspectives of 6 different characters, and they all think that something great is going to happen. But instead, there is a coup, which is very much like the GKChP, the August 91 coup in Moscow, which, however, at the end turns out to be a staged event that is then subverted, and after the shock of that, the real carnivalesque liberation begins. So trauma sometimes can be seen as something that shakes you up and then allows some sort of release of adrenaline that then perhaps would allow a new future possible. His second novel, Moscoviad, the Moscoviad, which was the first novel of his that I translated into English, is about specifically Ukraine saying goodbye to Moscow. And this is another tour de force kind of novel that explores many different styles. It's a one day in the life of a Ukrainian in Moscow as the Soviet Union is collapsing. And just like James Joyce's Ulysses, there are different chapters and different styles. And so it's a wonderful encyclopedia of different literary styles, but it's also a savage satire on the Soviet Empire as it is collapsing and disintegrating, and also a sobering, sometimes not very cheerful view of where culture is going. And the book gets very dark, but in the end gets at least a tentatively optimistic ending. And that is a typical element of a lot of post-colonial writing, where the ending is ambiguous. It may have gone bad, but there is at least a little bit of a glimmer of hope. Similar thing we find in the novella Laskava Proslov Shurograd, Welcome to Ratville, by Yuri Vinnichuk, another prominent Ukrainian writer of that generation, who was publishing underground in the 70s, early 80s, and who later on went to a very prolific career as a commercial writer, including guidebooks to the city of Lviv, including its, pre-World War II dialect, its traditional cooking, its coffee culture, and so on and so forth. But that novella which was published in the second issue of the journal Suchasnist, you see on the right. Suchasnist was the most important Ukrainian diasporic free journal, kind of like Polish Kultura. And in January 91, it returned to Ukraine, and Rekreacji by Andruchovich was published in the first issue, and Welcome to Ratville was published in the second issue of the journal that was now based in Ukraine. And in that book, it's a dystopian novel where a human was able to escape from a town where mutant rats took over humanity, and that becomes a metaphor for how totalitarian empires work and how they change your mindset and how they make resistance impossible, but some people do try to resist. So again, a dark text, but in a way powerful, with at least a glimmer of hope. And one of the most exciting writers at the time critiquing Soviet Empire and also Western fascination with Russian culture that was blind and oblivious to the imperial aspect of Russian culture, was Oksana Zabushko, and she remains one of Ukraine's leading contemporary intellects. And she developed as a poet first before switching to prose, and she's also been a prolific essayist. And to me, her collection of poems published in 1994 is one of the most remarkable, actually, analytical poetry that talks about the legacies of Soviet Empire and Ukraine trying to find its new independence. I also strongly recommend her April 1992 talk, which she gave at the Conference Intellectuals on Social Change in Central and Eastern Europe at Rutgers University. It was a conference that was a continuation of the Lisbon conferences of the late 80s. And in the Lisbon conferences, Ukrainians were never invited. There were East European writers or Central European writers from outside the Soviet Union. There were the Russians, and there would be just one token non-ethnically Russian representative of Russian literature, which in the main Lisbon conference was Armenian writer Grant Matavasyan, a talented writer, but that's a whole separate story. So Zabushko was a last-minute addition to the 92 conference, and she used this opportunity to deliver a very powerful message of why formerly colonized cultures are richer, more valuable, more diverse, and can tell you more about what is going on in the world, in part because colonial cultures have the double optics. They know both the culture of the colonizer and their own, while the colonizer usually does not know the culture of the colonized. So one of the poems in this collection, a poem that I'm still very fond of, which shockingly is still not available in English translation, is called Krym, Yalta, Прощание z Imperiu, so Crimea, Yalta, a farewell to empire. And that poem was written in January 92, so within weeks of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in this poem, she looks at this paradoxical combination of beautiful Mediterranean resort town, and she finds this woman who is a street musician who plays one of the songs associated with the legacy of the Gulag, the song Vorkuta Leningrad. And so I will give you somebody else reading the poem in the original Ukrainian, the actor Igor Prokopyuk. On the left, you see just the first three stanzas. The poem is longer, but in the interest of time, we'll just listen to him briefly, and then I'll continue with the rest of my presentation.
В цім розваленім часі, весною в приморському місті, де ніхто не вважає на часи, а лише на сезони. Що за щемна розрада? Ефіристий дух гостролисту. І під сирітськими пальмами в віялах мокрого блиску бабця в шапочці й чунях, в цурпалках обтятого хисту, що виводить на скрипці пісні некурортної зони. Я годую чайок. Їхні крики застуджено строї. Млява мінька долярів триває у шопці за рогом. Пес вганяється в хвилю й вискакує. Йому виноград темно-синій і млавиться море. І гу й дивно невлад, захлинаючись скрипка, біжить по железної дороги, де донині проноситься смерч Воркута Ленінград. Ех, патундрі, патундрі, прощайте совєтське дитинство. Поворот з таборів, шістдесятницький вірш, зразки первозвуків німого, хрущовка, що в голову тисне. Щось ніщо не спеклося із цього снітяного тіста. Крім жаркої, як пульс маяка, загоріться і згасне тоски.
So as we look further into the post-independence period, Ukrainian literary landscape gets richer and more diverse. And we, of course, hear a lot about the economic crisis of the 1990s and the associated chaos and traumas, but they become a rich source of literary material. And more recently, actually, in our time, of a very interesting cinematic reassessment of the 1990s in Ukraine that is going on now, that is very different, completely different from the vision of the 1990s we see in mainstream Russian culture, whether it's in literature, in cinema, or in other media. There is a great regional diversity and interest in exploring alternative histories, the what if both what if Ukrainian independence was maintained in the 1920s and 30s, or what if something else happened, and actually anticipating Russian invasion, Alexander Ivanets in his novel Rivne Rovno imagines Ukraine being divided, and his native city of Rivne becoming the equivalent of West Berlin, or Berlin, East and West Berlin in the Cold War days. Transcarpathia, Oksana Olsishina, whom I've already mentioned, but also Andriy Lyubka, a wonderful writer and now a heroic volunteer helping with the war effort in the context of the full-scale invasion. And of course, we have an incredible diversity of style of women writers. These are just a few names here. One of them, Yevgenia Kononenko, will be in the United States soon as a Fulbright Fellow. She's been in the US before. She was the first Ukrainian writer at the Iowa Writers Workshop. So I hope perhaps it will be possible to invite her as a speaker for this series. And the revolutions, the Orange Revolution of 2004 and then the Revolution of Dignity of 2014, even broadened and further expanded the reaches and diversity of this kind of work. Serhiy Zhadan is very interesting in this respect, in that he goes from sort of analyzing the Rust Belt disaffected youth to talking about really serious issues of colonial erasure of memories and identities and a search for uncovering those buried fragments. And then his novel Internat, The Orphanage, which is a stunning work documenting, responding to the earlier stage of Russia's war against Ukraine in the Donbass region, and where in the process of the novel, a remarkable thing happens. The main character, a 30-something who wants to be non-political, not involved, who wants the world to leave him alone, and who does not want to care, who does not read the news, and just wants to live like a basically snail in its shell. The circumstances force him basically to develop a political stance. So like Aristotle said, man is a political animal, to become a political animal, to grow a spine, to make decisions. And the book shows it in a very non-didactic, in a very inspiring way. Sofia Andrukhovich, the daughter of Yuri Andrukhovich, has become a wonderful major writer in her own right. And there are two novels of hers that I would like to highlight in particular. One, Felix Austria. I've just finished translating, so it's coming out later this year or early next year from Harvard in its contemporary Ukrainian literature series. It's a historical novel set in Western Ukraine under Austrian rule during the year 1900, but it also became a book about surface stability and explosive changes that really resonated with a lot of Ukrainians at the time of the Revolution of Dignity, because they became the most popular Ukrainian book of the year 2014. So it's very interesting that that kind of subversive, historically set Gothic novel was able to play this role. Her more recent novel, Amadoka, published in 2020, is a massive 800-page plus book. There was a bidding war for translation rights of it to the first ever for Ukrainian book at the London Book Fair. So we hope that it will be out in English in the next couple of years. And it's already available in German and in several other languages. And that novel combines three plot lines and talks about very important issues. One of them is Stalinist terror against Ukrainian intellectuals. The other one is the Holocaust and how the Holocaust unfolded on Ukrainian territory, and both in the place of the victims the bystanders, those who try to help, those who are too afraid to help. And the third one, with the war, at the time still the Donbass-focused first stage of the war, but it really is inspiring us also in the context of full-scale invasion now. And in diversity of voices is incredible. And of course, we have a lot of documentary writing and a lot of writing from the front, both poetry and prose. And as a native of Odessa, I would like to talk a little more here as a decolonizing aspect about this city of my birth and its myth and what is being done to subvert them. So we now, if you go to Instagram, you'll find the Odessa Decolonization Project that has been going on for a while. This is a screenshot from earlier, but from when it had just been launched, but it has been incredibly rich. And it's a series of public events and also research studies, opinion polls, that thinks of how can we decolonize the culture, the legacy of the city that for so many people for so long, so intensively was associated with the imperial project. That was the Russian Empire main commercial port in the 19th century. That in the Soviet Union also was associated with commercial trade. That was a city that was seen as not quite belonging to the mainstream imperial culture, but then still anchored in it, even if it's seen as a city resisting its official ideologies. So to look with that myth and how this myth came to be reproduced, flattened, reduced to stereotypes, and then exploited, including by contemporary Russian commercial culture of television and cinema, and until February of 2022 by local tourist industry. And now, of course, the city in a very painful way is trying to change that. Indeed, a few months ago, in March of this year, one of Odessa's leading contemporary intellectuals, journalist and poet and prose writer Zoya Kazanzhi, and her name alone is a testimony of the city's diversity. So Greek first name, Tatar last name, and that's the name of her husband. So she is, part of a multicultural family and is an embodiment of multicultural Odessa. Published this wonderful essay called "Who Are the Odessans and What Do We Want?" And this is title references the first president of Ukraine back in 1917, the eminent historian Mikhail Hrushevsky, and his pamphlet, Who Are the Ukrainians and What Do They Want?, which was published in May 1917 as an explanation for people, for broad readership, for whom Ukraine was something that came out of nowhere, to explain what Ukraine is, where it came from, why it is important, and so on and so forth. And in the essay, we have critical analysis of both the pitfalls and the promises of Odessa's tradition and potentials, and also an investigation of the rapid evolution of the city's identity since 2014, and especially since February 2022. And the traumas of 2014 were the first catalyst for the local critical rethinking in Odessa and the rest of Ukraine. For most, it was associated with the loss of life in Kyiv, the Revolution of Dignity. But in Odessa, we also had the May 2nd tragedy, where lives were lost. First, several pro-democracy demonstrators, and then several sort of pro-Russian, pro-Ancien regime demonstrators who ended up barricading themselves in one of the city's public buildings, and then that building caught fire in suspicious circumstances, and tragically more than 40 people died. And of course, the Russian propaganda was keen to exploit that. And so in the context of Crimea's annexation and the start of the war in Donbass, instead of looking for what divides us, what separates us, what angers us, to look at unity through diversity, exploring the diversity, both the present and the past. And on the right, you see Sotnikivsky Cvintar, the old Cossack cemetery within Odessa's city limits, which predates the official Russian date of founding of the city in 1794, and basically puts a lie to the Russian myth that Odessa was founded ex nihilo at the end of the 18th century, that there actually were people there. And it was not just, people, residents of the, associated with the Ottoman Empire, that there was a local Ukrainian population. And this is a photo from a volunteer event that was actually cleaning this cemetery after many years of neglect. Also, one of the ways in which local intellectuals were trying to come up with a different decolonial approach to the city has been through anchoring it in its visual arts legacy, not the literary myth, which has become very reductive and stereotyped, and basically making Odessa into the city of jolly Jewish gangsters. And yes, Odessa has a very historically prominent Jewish community. Not all of them are associated with organized crime, and obviously not all of them are jolly all the time. So instead of that reductive stereotype, we look at the city through different ways and try to find alternative coordinates. And one of them, you see here on the left, a painting by Yuri Yegorov, who is the leader of Odessa nonconformist artists of the 1960s and 1970s. And he basically said, yes, we need to think of Odessa as a city of August heat. So sitting in my Swiss apartment where there's no air conditioning, I very much relate to what Yegorov was saying, that this intense heat and blinding noonday sun, which we see on the painting on the left, creates a very different image. It's sort of a sensory idea of Odessa that is immediately recognizable, because we also see here vernacular old architecture, but it has nothing to do with the dominant imperial myth. And on the right, we see a painting by Alexander Roitburt, another wonderful Odessan painter who passed away in 21, so did not live to see full-scale invasion, but has done a lot in years before that to change Odessa's culture. And this one is a subversive play with Odessa's dominant signifiers. So we see here Odessa's famed opera house and the two giant ball sculptures that stand at the entrance of the Langeron beach. And those are both iconic elements, but here they're taken out of context and transformed into imaginary kind of romantic landscape. So the opera house is floating in the middle of the sea, and the beach is not really a beach. So something is a little bit like the Kiriko, but a little bit surrealist, but all in all, unmistakably Odessa. And the wonderful Odessa poet, Boris Khersonsky, his systematization and deconstruction of the Odessa myth has also been hugely important, both in his poetry and in his public social media feed, which then transformed into book versions. So the book you see on the left, Odesskaya Intelligentsiya, it personifies the character of the city intelligentsia and becomes sort of this ironic, subversive story of the character's misadventure. And on the right, you see his first book of poetry in Ukrainian. So Chersonsky, who started out as a prominent member of Odessa dissident circles back in the early 1970s, and who historically is a very important and prolific poet in Russian, started also writing poetry in Ukrainian and had been very actively involved in the dialogue between the two languages. And that somebody who is quite advanced in age, he's in his 70s, and who did not previously had much opportunity to create in Ukrainian, shows that a language change and multilinguality, polyglossia, is something that is very much possible for creative people in the city, and that they're very much participating in. The most interesting, one of the most interesting examples of a subversion of Odessa's myth is Ivan Kozlenko's novel Tanger, which symbolically uses the name of a city in Morocco, which is known as a free haven for international expatriates, and then nonconformist experimentation in the 20th century. And this novel, which was first published in 2007 and then a revised edition in 2017, is an interesting example of a Ukrainian novel taking a structure borrowed from another work of literature from another country, in this case, American novel, Michael Cunningham's The Hours, and using just the basic outline of the formula that Cunningham used, but to create an entirely original story focused in Odessa in the early 20th century and in the early 2000s. In Ukrainian literature, we have a precedent of this kind, a wonderful novel from the 1920s, Valerian Podmohylny's Misto, the city, which takes the basic plot outline of Maupassant's Bel Ami, but sets it in Kiev of the 1920s and dispenses with a lot of what was going on in Maupassant, but still recognizably pays homage, even though its story is entirely original. And in both Kozlenko's novel and in the earlier examples, you see the hybridity and ambiguity and ambivalence of the recorded and mythologized history explored, affirmed that actually it is a good, valuable thing to look into this hybridity and ambiguity and to productively work with them, not to look at them as a problem, but as a rich resource. And hence, Tanger, the city in Morocco, as a symbol. I mentioned the intertext, just like Michael Cunningham's novel is a dialogic engagement with Virginia Woolf's masterpiece, Mrs. Dalloway. Kozlenko's novel is a dialogue with Yuri Yanovsky's Meister Korabля, the shipbuilder or the shipmaster, which was first published in 1928, and which is one of the most fascinating works of Ukrainian literature of the 1920s revival, and is a novel set in Odessa in the middle of the boom of the film industry, the silent era film industry, which was in the 1920s Ukraine centered in Odessa, and which brought to Odessa a lot of cultural figures associated with other arts, like Alexander Dovzhenko, who is recognized as Ukraine's greatest film director of that generation, was a visual artist based in the city of Kharkiv. It brought here theater directors and visual artists and musicians and a lot of writers. So it was an incredibly rich and diverse time. And this is something that was de-emphasized in the official Soviet era tourist myth and, the mass culture myth. So paradoxically, one of the richest pages in the city's cultural history remained unknown and unappreciated both by most Odessans and also by most Ukrainians who cared about Ukrainian culture, where Odessa was somehow a marginalized, problematic city, where some people treated it with suspicion as not entirely Ukrainian. And so Yanovsky's novel, and at the center of which there is a messy, you would say, pansexual love triangle of two men and a woman that somehow make it work. And Kozlenko's novel, which does the same in the context of early 2000s Odessa, in the characters which seem to be similar to the characters of the 1920s, is a wonderful and productive work. More recently, already since the start of the full-scale invasion, there is another novel that is deeply focused on Odessa, but also takes us through the city and other areas. And this is Nina Kuryata's debut novel, Dзвінка. Dзвінka is a woman's name, subtitled Українка, народжена в СРСР, a Ukrainian woman born in the USSR. And this is both what in the Latin American tradition is known as testimonial, so a work of testimonial narrative, but also a Bildungsroman, sort of the story of an education of a character and the character finding their identity. And this is a very specific optics. So this is partly autobiographically based characters. So a Ukrainian woman, now about 50 years old, who was born into a Ukrainian-speaking family in a small town in the Odessa Oblast, who moved to the city very young, when she basically is in the second grade of elementary school, and then how she grew and developed within that city, how she emphasized her Ukrainian identity, the challenges she faced. At some point, she then moves to Kyiv, and how Kyiv treats her as an Odessan. So a lot of really important, rich reflections here. And to close, and before we go to our Q&A session, I will stop my sharing and thank you, and I will ask Professor Fett to share, because we've had technical difficulties with sharing it at my side. An example of Odessa resistance through culture. In the dark days of the first weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion, in the center of Odessa, to keep people's spirits, they had a series of live concerts known as Jazz na Balkoni, Jazz on the Balcony. They were also broadcast on Facebook Live. So here is a clip from one of those. So I'm stopping sharing and asking Dr. Fett to share that. It's a 3-minute recording. I don't think we can hear the sound. At least I can't.
Yeah, I can't either.
It was playing in the test.
I'm sorry. Wait a second. I will try to. Yes, I need to share. I stop sharing again. Share include sound. Yes, sorry about this. Share screen.
Вірна хвиля помпоза краде всі руки, і схили зелені одразу в серці лайки, посмішкою зустрічає, піснею провожає, вода сумати всі ведуть стежки. Ой, Одесо, мертвина біля моря, ой, Одесо, багато знала горя, гей, Одесо, південний любий край, живи моя Одесо, живи та розквітай, ой, Одесо, мені як наречена, ой, Одесо, ти мудрості навчена, гей, Одесо, коханий рідний край, живи моя Одесо, Одесо, живи та розквітай. В Одесі всі жінки такі, сміються залюбки. В Одесі хлопці всі такі, завжди як юнаки. Як так і не питайте, але насправді знаєте, такими вони нас народила. Ой, Одесо, перлина біля моря. Ой, Одесо, ти б знала багато горя. Гей, Одесо, південний любий край. Живи моя Одесо, живи та розквітай. Ой, Одесо, мені як наречена. Ой, Одеса, ти мудрості навчена. Гей, Одесо, коханий рідний край. Живи моя Одесо, живи та розквітай.
А вот третий куплет нужно на русском языке пояснить, что для некоторых типов кораблей и моряков третий куплет сейчас неприемлем. Но я его все-таки спою с поправочкой. Отправляются моряки, к которым это не относится, вам уже спела Александра Лосева. А мы все-таки споем то, что относится к адекватным, нормальным людям.
В Одесі є такий маяк, він світить всім завжди. І каже він, а об моря пливи скоріш сюди. Тут двері всім відкриті, і келихи налиті. Дівчата тут танцюють до зорі. Ой, Одесо, перлина біля моря. Ой, Одесо, багато знала горя. Гей, Одесо, південний любий край. Живи моя Одесо, живи та розквітай. Ой, Одесо, мені як наречена. Ой, Одесо, ти мудрості навчена. Гей, Одесо, коханий рідний край. Живи моя Одесо, живи та розквітай. Ще раз, живи моя Одесо, живи та розквітай. Живи моя Одесо, живи та розквітай.
Thank you, Victor, for sharing that.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, everyone. And I look forward to your questions in the time that we have remaining.
Let me just express my gratitude for this remarkably full and comprehensive overview, Dr. Chernetsky. This was amazingly great. I yield to other speakers and questions, although I have a lot to ask about Odesa, where all my father's family is from for many generations. Dr. Shrey.
I echo Victor Fett's words. You have done us and our listeners an amazing service. I love the way you've woven literary history, modern events, contemporary literary theory, important contemporary Ukrainian literary works for us, and making connections with other literatures and situating Ukrainian literature in its proper place among world. And this, I think it's hard for me. I'm getting a little emotional because our audience includes many people like myself who grew up attending Ukrainian school on Saturdays. So this is a little bit of a comment before I lead to my question. And as early as 5th grade in Ukrainian Saturday school, we began to study Ukrainian literature from 5th grade onward. It's truly emotional hearing all the amazing things that have happened since, and how the major conversation academia has had about colonized cultures, of course, applied to Ukrainian literature. This is so. Thank you. When literary theory was first introduced to American English departments in the 1980s, terms like subversive, deconstruction, intertextuality were met with a lot of suspicion. So I can only imagine the challenges the writers and academics faced in the post-Soviet period. So I'm leading to my question. And it's about someone I truly admire and love. And you mentioned the writer twice in your amazing survey of modern Ukrainian writers. It's Alexander Irvanets. And we've been very, very, very fortunate to have him multiple times here in the United States. And in fact, he has a strong following in Philadelphia, and I suspect other cities as well. And shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, many of us were relieved to hear that he was able to escape one of the areas most brutally targeted by Russian soldiers. But at the same time, he was understandably heartbroken. And as I can imagine, everyone in Ukraine is. Can you speak a little bit more about the group Boo that you mentioned that he was in, and a little bit more about his impact on Ukrainian culture and literary history?
Thank you so much for this wonderful question. So to return, Bubaboo is probably the central phenomenon in Ukrainian literature and more broadly Ukrainian culture that for many Ukrainians as well as outsiders of Ukraine made contemporary culture cool and exciting. These were, and their poetry readings, attracted the audience in the hundreds. They packed halls for contemporary poetry, which a lot of contemporary poets around the world would be very envious of that. And they sort of had a cult following. And what they did is simultaneously reached back to the suppressed Ukrainian past, but the past of innovative culture, of modernist literature, but also urbanism, of global connection. So Bogdan Igor Antonich, a wonderful Ukrainian modernist poet, active in the early 1930s, died tragically young of a botched appendectomy operation. He was one of the inspiration, but simultaneously playing with contemporary culture, playing with the Soviet mass culture and creating works that through this playfulness signaled freedom. And this was just so hugely important to not to have Ukrainian literature that you see associated with either conformity being sort of beaten and suppressed by the Soviets and sort of being this horrible, half zombified figure sort of completely chained by the empire, or this, very, very determined underground person who is very serious and very determined in their work, but it's somehow joyless.
Yeah.
So they emphasize the joy that in letting go, in consigning Soviet Union to the trash heap, we have a joyous event. And yes, the transition of the early 90s was messy and complicated, and the economic suffering was very, very real. But you would not find in Ukraine that kind of pernicious discourse about how evil that time was, and that something that the Russian official culture has explored, basically equating freedom with danger and instability, and basically making ordinary people to think that freedom is bad because freedom is dangerous and being unfree is much safer. And this is where basically Russian culture has the official government supported line of Russian culture has been going for the last quarter century. And in Ukraine, what happened is the carnival happened, but then in the context of the 1990s, even as the Bubaboo writers, they went their separate ways, they remained friends, but no longer an organized group, they started this sort of critical exploration of different possibilities. I mentioned that alternative history. Irvanets, whom you mentioned, he wrote 2 alternative history novels, Rivne Rovno and Ukraine 1938, where we have Ukraine has an independent government. Germany is led by Ernst Thälmann, so the Nazis did not come to power. And so in this wonderful world of alternative history, where very serious things are happening and very serious questions are asked. So he also, because he is very successful as a playwright, and in drama, it's often very much, it's about ethical questions. He is able to put an ethical choice front and center. He even has a small play called Маленька п'єса про зраду для однієї актриси, sort of a short play about betrayal for one actress, which is like a one-person play that is available in English translation. And but his other works, I mean, they do that too. I wish more of his work was translated. Not enough of his work has been translated. Yuri Andruhovich has much more of his work available. Viktor Nabarak stayed more with poetry. He also has done some work of literary scholarship. And we do have a good bilingual volume, pretty comprehensive, that was done by Professor Michael Naidan from Penn State. So they are now sort of the elder statesmen. They are Oksana Zabushka, who was born in 1960. So some in 1960, 61. So these are now people in the early 60s, but you know, you look at them in different eyes. And we have now their children. We have Nabarak's daughter, who is a very important cultural figure, and Andruhovich's daughter, Sofia, who is a major writer. So it's interesting how this generational shift has happened, and we see, however, a rediscovery and a return to their works precisely of the early 1990s, talking to a new generation. There have been new editions of that work and new literary readings now in the context of the war. So we now are going through a second wave, which we now have historicization of that. So this is no longer looked at as contemporary culture, but something that was pivotal in the recent past, but we now have enough of a perspective that we apply different analytical tools than we do when you're doing the culture, when you're in the midst of things happening.
Wow. Thank you for your beautiful and brilliant explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Katerina. More questions from our viewers, please, our moderators and audience. As you are thinking, I know we have been here for more than an hour. We will soon let Professor Chernetsky go, but I cannot, of course, not ask about Odesa. It is not that important for our audience right now, but there is a wave of, I would say, very colonial emotion right now as streets are renamed in Odessa, and obviously many writers who were from Odessa, who wrote in Russian, who are, I guess, more known in the West, like Ilya Petrov and Babel. What do you take of all this? Is it just is indicative of something, or these are just last throws of those who want to cling to the pieces of empire?
Well, to explain to our audience, there has been this very messy development where by fiat, the head of the regional oblast level military administration signed a list of changes of street names. And there were a lot of strange changes made there. And there were some, and basically it became something that has been quite criticized by many people, including by writers whom I mentioned, because this was not done by involving the community. So basically what has happened is, and this is part of the problem of the civic culture, is that in many other cities of Ukraine, we've had the more vocal civil society being able to get involved in a prominent level. In Odessa, it remains a prominent group, but without direct access to people in power. So neither the current mayor of the city or the head of the regional administration can be seen as an intellectual. So in fact, both of them have problematic past, and lustration efforts, uncovered, various unsavory things. So we have a problem in that Odessa has a a robust and active civil society, like the Decolonization project, and a lot of wonderful people involved in there, but it's still a relative minority within the city. And what this renaming is that was done by, by Mr. Keeper, the head of the regional military administration, has nothing to do with what the civil society discussions were going on. So this is basically what, the Russians say, in many languages there is said is that, this is the kind of favor that you do not want. In Russian, it's called medvezhye usluga. Sort of, this is the kind of favor that actually does more harm than good. And the comments were that, worthy people like Alexander Roitburt and Kira Muratova were dragged into this. And so what might happen is actually because of the messiness and of the opposition of many people to the renaming, there would be the negative attitude to these very worthy cultural figures, the wonderful writer, the wonderful filmmaker who actually suffered through a lot. Another important part of the commentary here that I've seen and that I agree with, and that is people grumble, but they do not get involved proactively. So, and this is something that we need to change, because we see that happening with greater success in other places. In Odesa, we saw that happen in 22, in those first months of full-scale invasion. But in Ukraine, in general, now we're in the third year of the full-scale invasion and the 11th year of the war. There is exhaustion. We talk about the Ukrainian resilience. You cannot be resilient forever. And this is something that clearly, the Russian, regime is actively trying to exploit. And mistakes are made when people are stressed and tired. When you're stressed and tired, you start making more mistakes. So, and I think this renaming initiative, the decree of Mr. Keeper from a couple of days ago was one of those mistakes.
I'm asking, I know this is not a major important question, but we have very similar developments we have had for years in the United States here. So we know how people react to the surface issues like this, which involve major symbols, from Columbus to Cervantes.
Yes.
In the United States. More questions from our audience or viewers, please, more comments. I know we have some people here who have read much more than I did in Ukrainian of authors you mentioned. We tried to get some of them on the panel. I admit that definitely this is not something I know in detail. So your lecture is superbly educational. Katerina, please.
Actually, Victor, this is a question for you in light of Dr. Chernetsky's lecture or presentation. Yes. When we talked about this a little bit about the Soviet era school curriculum and its reductive messaging, and then you shared a poem with us read by Igor Prokop, the actor. In that poem, there's a line, "Прощайте совєтське дитинство," farewell Soviet childhood. Victor, you, and another piece to bring into this, we often talk on this program about the complexities of identity. And you've certainly addressed that here, talking about how the colonizer doesn't understand the colonized, but the colonized understand. But there's a lot of, I'm very grateful for so much of what you've shared with us. Victor, I am wondering, you listening to this presentation must have had some memories from your childhood, because your identity is very complex. You're born in Ukraine, raised in Russia, and spent half your life in the United States. Would you kind of care to comment, maybe respond to that?
It would take us another couple of hours even to dig briefly, but yes, just we share a very common background with Dr. Chernetsky, because we arrived to the United States at essentially the same time in late 80s, and Odessa was my first major city, because I never seen a sea before For the first time at 8 years of age, I saw my first sea in Odesa. It was very, how to say, holiday city for me, because it was summer vacation, the sea was shining, everyone in Navy uniform, the Vorontsov lighthouse. I remember Odessa as a wonderful place, and I didn't know at 8 years of age that I was seeing the remnants of the empire, the city, and when my grandfather almost died in 1922, his words to me were, I married and was lucky to be left alive. I can quote forever. Now, growing up in the Soviet Union, the only thing I can say briefly, we didn't know most of what was going around. We were growing up, even in intellectual families like mine, it was a huge bubble, and bubble, informational bubble, everything. We built those bubbles. My Odessa was Odessa of Babel and Ilf and Petrov. It was not real Odessa. It didn't have Ukrainian, it hardly had Yiddish, it did not mention Greeks or Bulgarians, it definitely didn't mention Holodomor, my bubble of Odessa. And the same, probably much, much even more remote for many who grew up in larger cities than I did. For me, it was Europe, but very little piece of Europe. So emotionally, I am tied to, like we all are, to the memories, but now we're past those 40 years in the desert. I'm afraid we will get another 40 easily.
Thank you. We have a comment in the chat. One of our regular viewers expresses gratitude for your presentation, as I'm sure we all do.
Thank you.
Yes, we do. We do, and we hope to have you one day back, and we definitely want to keep in touch. Thank you, Dr. Chernetsky, for joining our 127th weekly meeting from Basel, Switzerland. And whether you have any questions or comments, please.
I just, wanted to say that I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I really admire your university for the consistency of this series, because in a lot of places, there are just one-off events or like one event a year. So to have a series like this going is a remarkable accomplishment. So yes, thank you for this opportunity, and yes, I'll be glad to come back and talk about other topics. This was more sort of a general introductory topic. We can get deeper into the weeds, into the nitty-gritty of different aspects of Ukrainian culture, contemporary or further into the past.
Thank you so much. I will ask Dr. Frey to say our customary greetings to our viewers in Ukraine, please.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Героям слава!